September 15th, 1944. Rain drummed against the wooden sides of the cattle car as it lurched to a final stop somewhere in the Yorkshire countryside. Hans Müller pressed his face against the narrow gap between the boards, watching British soldiers form neat lines along the railway platform. After 3 days of transport across the Channel and through the English countryside, the moment he'd been dreading had finally arrived. The heavy doors scraped open with a metallic screech that made every prisoner flinch. Cold English air rushed into the stifling compartment, carrying the scent of wet earth and coal smoke. Hans stepped down onto the gravel platform, his legs unsteady after days of confinement. Around him, 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation, men from the 352nd Infantry Division captured during the desperate fighting in Normandy. Klaus Weber, barely 19 and still bearing the soft features of youth despite months of war, stumbled beside Hans. The boy's uniform hung loose on his diminished frame, testament to the meagre rations they'd survived on during the retreat through France. Behind them, Friedrich Hoffmann spat into the gravel and muttered under his breath about British brutality they were about to experience. Hans had heard the stories. Every German soldier knew what to expect from capture. The propaganda broadcasts from Berlin had been explicit and terrifying. British Empire, built on colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings, starvation, forced labor unto death. Better to die fighting than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Yet as Hans looked around the platform, he saw something unexpected. Order. British guards stood in neat formations, rifles held properly, uniforms clean despite the weather. No shouting, no chaos, just quiet professional military discipline that reminded Hans uncomfortably of German standards, the standards his shattered division had abandoned during their desperate retreat. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged with a steady gaze that suggested he'd seen everything war could offer, and remained unimpressed by all of it. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German, his voice carrying across the assembled prisoners. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly. Is this understood?" The tone wasn't cruel or kind. It was simply matter of fact, soldiers addressing soldiers. Hans found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. The search was thorough, but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored. Wounded prisoners were separated for immediate medical attention. Then came water, British soldiers moving down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been their enemies days earlier. Hans drank the water, cold and clean, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that his first experience of British captivity contradicted every warning he'd received. No beatings, no starvation, just professional military procedure, executed with the calm efficiency that characterized everything British. As trucks arrived to transport them to the camp, Hans overheard 2 British guards talking in English he partially understood. One said something about poor bastards, and the other replied, "Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly." That phrase would define Hans's next 18 months in British captivity, teaching him uncomfortable truths about the regime he'd fought for and the civilization he'd been taught to despise. The truck convoy wound through rolling Yorkshire countryside, past stone walls and sheep pastures that looked nothing like the bombed landscapes Hans had grown accustomed to in France. Klaus pressed against the truck's canvas side, staring at farmhouses with intact roofs and windows that still held glass. It was his first glimpse of a country that hadn't been devastated by war. Camp 174 appeared through the afternoon mist, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Nothing luxurious, but weatherproof, organized, clean. The processing was systematic: documentation, medical examination, assignment to barracks, explanation of camp rules, everything conducted in German by British personnel who'd learned the language or through interpreters. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners and prepared accordingly. Hans was assigned to Barracks 12 with Klaus and Fritz. The building was basic but dry, with real beds and blankets that smelled of soap rather than mold. After months of sleeping in muddy foxholes and bombed buildings, the simple comfort of a clean mattress felt almost luxurious. "Don't get comfortable," Fritz warned, settling onto his assigned bunk. This is just the softening up. Real brutality starts once they've got us relaxed. Klaus nodded nervously, clutching a photograph of his mother that had somehow survived the search. The boy had been conscripted straight from his apprenticeship at a Berlin bakery, thrust into war with barely 6 weeks of training. Everything he knew about the world came from Nazi propaganda and the terrifying chaos of combat. Hans said nothing, but privately wondered if Fritz was right. The British efficiency suggested long-term planning rather than temporary deception. Why invest in proper facilities and systematic processing if they intended to simply murder their prisoners? As evening approached, a British corporal appeared at their barracks door. "Dinner formation in 10 minutes, he announced in careful German. "Bring your mess kits." The prisoners filed out into the gathering dusk, joining lines of men from other barracks. Hans noticed the British guards maintained professional distance, but showed no signs of hostility. They were watchful, but not aggressive, alert, but not cruel. It was the bearing of soldiers doing their duty rather than men preparing for violence. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. Steam rose from serving stations where British soldiers ladled food onto metal trays. The smell hit Hans first, rich and meaty and completely unexpected. His stomach, accustomed to watery soup and stale bread, cramped with sudden hunger. Klaus grabbed Hans's arm. "Something's wrong," he whispered. "That smells like real food." They shuffled forward in line, each prisoner receiving a metal tray from a stack beside the serving station. Hans watched the man ahead of him approach the first server, a burly British soldier, who spooned a generous portion of what appeared to be roast beef onto the tray. The next server added a mound of mashed potatoes, then carrots, then a thick slice of bread with actual butter. Hans's turn came. The British soldier looked at him with neutral professionalism and loaded his tray with the same generous portions. Roast beef, still steaming, mashed potatoes with gravy, cooked carrots that looked fresh rather than preserved, bread that was soft and warm, a pat of butter, a mug of tea, and at the end of the line, a serving of what appeared to be apple pudding. Hans stared at his tray in disbelief. The amount of food was staggering, more than he'd seen in a single meal since before the war began, more than his unit had received in a week during the final desperate fighting in Normandy. The tray was so loaded that he had to balance it carefully to prevent spillage. He found a seat at one of the long tables, Klaus and Fritz settling beside him. Around them, other prisoners sat in stunned silence, staring at their trays as if they contained something impossible. "This can't be right," Klaus whispered, his voice barely audible above the quiet conversations filling the hall. Hans looked at the abundance before him and felt a strange mixture of hunger and suspicion. The meat alone represented more protein than he'd consumed in months. The vegetables were fresh, not the withered roots they'd scavenged during the retreat. The bread was white and soft, a luxury he'd almost forgotten existed. He leaned toward Klaus and Fritz, keeping his voice low. "We're meant to share this for a week." The question hung in the air between them. Hans had assumed that the generous portions were meant to be divided among several prisoners, rationed carefully to last multiple days. It was the only explanation that made sense. No army, especially one fighting a global war, could afford to feed prisoners this well on a daily basis. Fritz poked at the roast beef with his fork, his expression skeptical. "Has to be poisoned," he muttered, "or drugged. They're going to kill us all tonight." Klaus nodded nervously, but Hans noticed the boy's eyes never left the food. The smell was intoxicating after months of hunger. Hans's own stomach was cramping with need, his body demanding that he eat regardless of the consequences. Around them, other prisoners were having similar conversations. Some refused to touch their food, convinced it was poisoned. Others ate tentatively, taking small bites and waiting for symptoms. A few, driven by desperate hunger, devoured everything on their trays and sat back looking guilty and terrified. Hans picked up his fork and cut a small piece of the roast beef. The meat was tender, properly cooked, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. It tasted like food from before the war, from a world where meals were about nourishment rather than mere survival. He took another bite, then another, his body's needs overriding his mind's cautions. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich, made with real milk and butter. The carrots were sweet and perfectly cooked. The bread was fresh enough that steam rose when he broke it open. Even the tea was proper tea, hot and strong, not the bitter substitutes they'd grown accustomed to in Germany. As Hans ate, he watched the British guards moving through the hall. They weren't gloating or watching for signs of poisoning. They were simply maintaining order, ensuring the meal proceeded smoothly. Some even helped elderly prisoners who struggled with their trays. It was the behavior of men running a dining facility, not executioners preparing victims. "Attention!" called a British officer from the front of the hall. He spoke in German, his accent thick but understandable. "You will eat 3 meals daily at designated times, breakfast at 700 hours, lunch at 1200 hours, dinner at 1800 hours. Anyone who misses formation without medical excuse will forfeit that meal. Medical staff will evaluate prisoners requiring special diets. 3 meals daily." Hans felt his worldview shifting as the implications sank in. This wasn't a week's worth of food on his tray. This was 1 meal of 3 served every day. The British were planning to feed them like this consistently, not as a one-time gesture before execution. Klaus had gone pale. 3 times, he whispered. Every day. Fritz was staring at his half-empty tray as if it contained something supernatural. That's impossible. No army feeds prisoners this well, not even their own soldiers. But Hans was remembering conversations with British prisoners his unit had captured earlier in the war. They'd spoken of adequate rations, medical care, treatment according to international law. Hans had dismissed it as propaganda at the time, but now he wondered if those men had been telling the truth. The apple pudding was sweet and warm, made with real apples and sugar. Hans hadn't tasted anything so indulgent since before the war began. As he ate, he found himself thinking about his wife Maria, back in Bavaria. She'd been surviving on ration cards and ersatz coffee for years while he fought across Europe. The irony was bitter. He was eating better as a prisoner of war than his family was eating at home. When the meal ended, prisoners were dismissed by barracks to return to their quarters. Hans walked back through the camp in a daze, his stomach full for the first time in months. The sensation was almost uncomfortable after so long with inadequate food. In Barracks 12, the conversations continued late into the night. Some prisoners remained convinced the food was poisoned and they would all be dead by morning. Others argued it was psychological warfare, designed to make them soft before the real brutality began. A few suggested the British were simply following international law regarding prisoner treatment. Hans lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he'd experienced. The meal had been better than anything he'd eaten during his last months of freedom in Germany. The British guards had been professional, but not cruel. The facilities were basic, but adequate. Everything contradicted the propaganda he'd been fed about Allied treatment of prisoners. Klaus was crying quietly in the next bunk, overwhelmed by the day's revelations. Fritz maintained his cynical commentary, but Hans noticed he'd eaten every scrap of food on his tray. Whatever the British intentions, their prisoners were going to sleep with full stomachs for the first time in months. Morning came with the sound of a bugle, rather than shouting guards. Hans woke feeling more rested than he had in weeks, his body finally able to relax without the constant gnawing of hunger. Around him, other prisoners stirred with similar expressions of confused relief. They were alive, unharmed, and about to discover if the previous night's meal had been an aberration or the new normal. Breakfast formation was called at 700 hours sharp. Hans joined the line of prisoners filing toward the mess hall, many still moving with the cautious uncertainty of men who expected the situation to change at any moment. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of cooking food from the kitchen. The breakfast was substantial: porridge with milk and sugar, eggs, bacon, toast with jam and tea. Again, the portions were generous, the quality far better than Hans had expected. Klaus ate with the desperate intensity of someone still convinced each meal might be his last. Fritz maintained his suspicious commentary, but cleaned his plate thoroughly. Hans found himself studying the British guards more carefully. They were professional soldiers, many bearing the ribbons of campaigns in North Africa, Italy, or France. These were men who'd fought against Germans, seen their comrades killed by German weapons, yet they showed no signs of personal animosity toward their prisoners. They maintained discipline and order without cruelty or revenge. After breakfast, prisoners were assigned to work details. Hans was selected for agricultural labor at a nearby farm, along with Klaus and a dozen other men. The work assignment came with additional information that further challenged his preconceptions. Workers would receive extra rations to compensate for physical labor, medical attention for any injuries, and rest periods during the day. The farm was a 20-minute walk from the camp, through countryside that looked like something from a peacetime postcard. Stone walls divided green fields where sheep grazed peacefully. Farmhouses sat undamaged among gardens that still grew flowers alongside vegetables. It was Hans's first extended look at a country that hadn't been devastated by war. The farmer who supervised their work detail was a weathered man in his 50s named Thompson, who spoke no German but communicated through gestures and simple English words. He showed them how to repair stone walls, clear drainage ditches, and prepare fields for winter planting. The work was hard but not deliberately cruel. Thompson expected competent effort, but didn't drive them beyond reasonable limits. At midday, Thompson's wife appeared with a thermos of tea and sandwiches for the work detail. She looked nervous around the German prisoners, but offered the food politely, even attempting a few words in broken German. Hans accepted the sandwich, thick with cheese and ham, and found himself nodding his thanks to a woman whose country he'd been trying to destroy months earlier. The afternoon brought more revelations. When Klaus stumbled and cut his hand on a sharp stone, Thompson immediately stopped work and examined the wound. He cleaned it with water from his own canteen, applied a proper bandage from a first aid kit, and sent Klaus to sit in the shade until the bleeding stopped. No shouting, no punishment for clumsiness, just practical medical attention. Hans watched this interaction with growing confusion. Thompson treated Klaus's injury exactly as he would treat any worker's accident, with competent care and reasonable concern. There was no sense that German prisoners deserved less consideration than British workers would receive. The evening meal back at camp was roast chicken with vegetables and potatoes, followed by bread pudding with custard. Again, the portions were generous and the quality excellent. Hans was beginning to accept that this wasn't temporary kindness, but systematic policy. The British were genuinely feeding their prisoners well, consistently, and without apparent ulterior motive. That night, Hans began writing his first letter home. The camp allowed prisoners to write one letter per week, subject to censorship, but otherwise unrestricted. Hans struggled with how to describe his experiences to Maria. How could he explain that he was eating better as a prisoner than she was as a free citizen? How could he tell her that the British, whom Nazi propaganda portrayed as brutal colonial oppressors, were treating him with more consideration than his own army had shown its soldiers? He settled on careful understatement. I am well and healthy. The British treat us according to international law. We work, we eat adequately, we are not abused. Do not worry about my condition here. But even those simple words felt revolutionary. They contradicted everything German civilians had been told about Allied treatment of prisoners. If his letter reached Maria, and if she shared its contents with neighbors, it would undermine Nazi propaganda about the war's stakes and consequences. The second week brought a routine that further normalized the impossible. 3 substantial meals daily, fair work assignments, medical care for the sick and injured, recreational time in the evenings. Hans found himself looking forward to meals not just for the food, but for the simple pleasure of eating without fear or urgency. Klaus was gaining weight, his hollow cheeks filling out as his body recovered from months of malnutrition. Fritz had stopped predicting imminent execution, though he maintained that the good treatment was temporary. Other prisoners were adapting at different rates, some still suspicious, others beginning to accept their new reality. The work at Thompson's farm continued to challenge Hans's preconceptions. Thompson treated the German prisoners as workers rather than enemies, showing them proper techniques, providing adequate tools, and maintaining reasonable expectations. When Hans demonstrated particular skill at stone wall repair, Thompson nodded approvingly and assigned him to more complex projects. More surprisingly, Thompson began teaching Hans basic English words related to farm work. Stone, he would say, pointing to the materials. Wall, good. Bad, more, enough. Hans found himself responding, learning practical vocabulary that made the work more efficient. It was his first positive interaction with an English civilian, conducted without hatred or fear on either side. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Hans was sleeping better, eating regularly, working productively, and beginning to think beyond mere survival. For the first time since the war began, he had mental space to consider larger questions about the conflict and his role in it. The British treatment of prisoners raised uncomfortable comparisons with German behavior. Hans remembered Soviet prisoners his unit had captured, men who'd been given minimal food, inadequate shelter, and often died from neglect or deliberate cruelty. He remembered Jewish civilians his unit had encountered, people who'd simply disappeared after being handed over to SS units. The contrast with his own treatment was stark and troubling. If the British could maintain civilized standards while holding enemy prisoners, what did that say about German behavior toward captives? If democratic societies could fight total war without abandoning basic human decency, what did that suggest about Nazi claims that such decency was weakness? These questions became more pressing as autumn progressed into winter. Hans's letters home became slightly more detailed, describing adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions. He knew the censors read every word, but they allowed his descriptions to pass. The British seemed content to let German families learn that their captured relatives were being treated well. Maria's replies, when they came, revealed the contrast between his situation and conditions in Germany. Food shortages were worsening, bombing raids were increasing, and morale was declining. She wrote carefully, knowing her letters were also censored, but Hans could read between the lines. His wife was struggling with privations he no longer faced. The irony was bitter and enlightening. As a prisoner of war, Hans was safer, better fed, and more secure than his family at home. The British were protecting and providing for their enemies, while Germany struggled to care for its own citizens. The implications challenged everything he'd believed about the war's purpose and justification. Christmas 1944 brought the most profound revelation yet. Camp authorities announced that prisoners could organize religious services for the holiday, both Protestant and Catholic. Hans joined the Protestant service, held in a decorated barracks where prisoners had created improvised ornaments from scraps of paper and cloth. As they sang Stille Nacht in German, their voices carrying across the camp in the cold winter air, Hans noticed British guards stopping to listen. When the song ended, several guards quietly applauded. One sergeant entered the barracks afterward and distributed cigarettes and biscuits, saying simply, "Happy Christmas, lads." The gesture broke something inside Hans. Here were men whose comrades he'd killed, whose country he'd tried to destroy, treating him with dignity during his most sacred holiday. They could have forbidden the service, mocked their prayers, or ignored their humanity entirely. Instead, they'd shown respect for traditions and beliefs that transcended national boundaries. That night, Hans wrote a different kind of letter to Maria. "I understand something now that I didn't before. These people we've been fighting, they're not the barbarians we were told they were. They're civilized men who've maintained their principles even toward enemies. What we've been told about this war, about why we're fighting, I think much of it has been lies." The letter was returned by censors, too explicit in its criticism of German propaganda. But Hans had needed to write the words, even if they couldn't be sent. The act of articulating his changing understanding helped clarify thoughts that had been forming for months. Winter deepened, but the camp routine continued unchanged. 3 meals daily, fair work assignments, medical care, recreational activities. Hans was learning more English from Thompson and beginning to read British newspapers provided in the camp library. The news was heavily censored, but it still provided information about the war's progress that German propaganda had concealed. The newspapers described German atrocities in occupied territories, concentration camps, systematic murder of civilians. Hans had heard rumors of such things, but dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Now, reading detailed accounts while experiencing British fairness firsthand, he began to accept that the reports might be true. If Germany was committing the atrocities described in British newspapers, and if Britain was maintaining civilized standards even toward enemy prisoners, then Hans had been fighting for the wrong side. The realization was devastating and liberating simultaneously. Devastating because it meant his service had supported evil, liberating because it explained the cognitive dissonance he'd been experiencing. Spring 1945 brought news of Germany's collapse. Hitler's suicide, Berlin's fall, unconditional surrender. Hans received the information with mixed emotions: relief that the killing was over, grief for his destroyed country, uncertainty about his future, and growing clarity about the war's moral dimensions. As repatriation discussions began, Hans faced a choice he hadn't anticipated. The British government, facing severe labor shortages, was allowing prisoner volunteers to remain temporarily as civilian workers. Hans could return to bomb Germany and an uncertain future, or stay in Britain and continue the agricultural work he'd learned to do well. The decision revealed how completely his perspective had changed. 6 months earlier, he would have chosen repatriation without hesitation, eager to escape enemy territory and return home. Now he found himself considering voluntary extension of his stay in a country that had treated him better than his own government ever had. Thompson had indicated that Hans would be welcome to continue working on the farm as a civilian employee. The work was honest, the treatment fair, and the future more promising than anything waiting in devastated Germany. Maria's latest letters described conditions that made Britain seem like a refuge rather than a prison. Hans made his decision during a final meal in the camp mess hall, the same hall where he'd first experienced the shocking generosity of British prisoner treatment. The same tables where he'd learned that enemies could maintain civilized standards, even toward those who'd fought against them. He would stay in Britain, at least temporarily, not as a prisoner of war, but as a voluntary worker, contributing to the recovery of a country he'd once tried to destroy. The transformation was complete, from enemy soldier to willing participant in British society. The final irony came during his last conversation with Sergeant Thompson, the British NCO who'd supervised camp discipline throughout Hans's captivity. Thompson had maintained professional distance but fair treatment, never cruel but never familiar. Now, as Hans prepared to leave as a civilian worker, Thompson offered his hand. "You were a good prisoner, Müller," Thompson said in his careful German. "Worked hard, caused no trouble, learned from your experiences. I think you'll make a good civilian worker too." Hans shook the offered hand, feeling the strange emotion of gratitude toward a man who'd been his captor. "Thank you, Sergeant, for everything, for showing me what civilization really means." Thompson nodded. "That's what we were fighting for, wasn't it? To prove that decent treatment and fair play aren't weakness, they're strength. You learned that lesson well." As Hans walked away from Camp 174 for the last time, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from enemy prisoner to voluntary resident. It had begun with a simple question about sharing a week's worth of food. It had ended with a complete transformation of his understanding about civilization, morality, and the true meaning of strength. The British had defeated him militarily on the battlefield, but more importantly, they'd defeated him morally through their treatment of prisoners. They'd shown that maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. That lesson would stay with Hans for the rest of his life, a testament to the power of decency over brutality, of civilization over barbarism. Years later, Hans would tell his British-born children about that first meal in Camp 174, when he'd asked if they were meant to share the food for a week. He'd learned that true abundance wasn't measured in quantity of food, but in quality of treatment. The British had given him more than adequate meals. They'd given him a new understanding of what it meant to be civilized. If this story of unexpected humanity during wartime moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more untold historical narratives that challenge what we think we know about the past. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these remarkable human stories to light. If you're already part of our community, a like would mean the world to us and helps others discover these important historical accounts. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever encountered a story that completely changed your perspective on a historical event? What other prisoner of war experiences would you like us to explore?